If you want to get good at AI tools, it also helps to understand their failure scenarios. And in this video, we're going to talk about one such a failure scenario that I noticed that makes an appearance in the data analyst feature of OpenAI. It's a subtle failure, but because it's subtle, it can actually be kind of dangerous too. So I'm going to show you the failure in just a bit, but before getting there, it helps to explain the story behind this one dataset that I'll be using, because it's kind of an important dataset in general, I think. What you gotta imagine is there's this university and there's a class of students and they all study statistics, and the professor decides to split the group of students into two separate groups. So we've got group A and we've got group B. And the point is that they all have to analyze the same data set. It's a data set with stuff that you might be able to expect that comes out of a smartwatch. So you've got body mass index, you've got gender, and I believe there were also steps per day, I think. But the dataset just had these three variables, and you can kind of imagine lots of different statistical tasks that you might be able to perform here. But what you would hope, of course, is that if you give students that all took the same class the same dataset, that they would perform the same analysis, or at least come to the same conclusion. But there was a subtle difference between the two groups. This first group, group A over here, that group actually got a couple of hypotheses to check for. So hypothesis 1 was something along the lines of, is there a statistical significant difference between the number of steps between the men and the women? And there was also this other hypothesis that was about the correlation between steps and body mass index. And the last one was also about the correlation, but the first one was for men and the last one was for women. This group got these hypotheses, and the whole point was that they were supposed to check them, but afterwards they could also explore the data set and also report any findings that they might have. And Group B actually got a fairly different task. They were just asked the question, hey, what's in the data? No hypotheses whatsoever, but they were supposed to look for interesting statistical patterns in the data that they could report on. Now I gotta repeat myself here. What you're really hoping for is that people come to the same conclusion. If there's an obvious story inside of this data set, then these hypotheses that you get in the beginning, they shouldn't distract you, should they? So this setup was part of a research paper. The name of the paper is A Hypothesis is a Liability. And the kicker in this entire task was that both groups really did get the same data set. It's just that the data set itself was completely bopkis. This is what the data set looked like. Yes, you had number of steps, and yes, you've got body mass index, and the color of the dot here explains whether or not you are a man or a woman in the dataset, but people were just really being plain fooled. There was a gorilla in the dataset, so to say, and the question is, did the people who got the hypotheses to check for, did they notice this gorilla? Or was it more likely that the people who didn't get hypotheses that they were able to check this gorilla? And there's some numbers here, but what I thought was particularly interesting is, it could be the case that if you get hypotheses to check for, that you're going to go down a rabbit hole instead of taking a step back and then doing the proper exploration yourself. You might be at risk of losing out on this crucial bit of the story of the data if you distract yourself with hypotheses. That's kind of a point that this paper tries to make. So I was wondering, humans aren't necessarily perfect at this, but would OpenAI also be able to fail at this task? I was just kind of curious. If I were to give this particular data set to the data analysis tool of OpenAI, what would happen? So I did, and let's have a look. And that brings me to this chat that I had last night. It doesn't render super well on top over here, but what happened was that I gave ChatGPT the CSV file, and I asked it, what is the main story in this dataset? So this would be the conversation without giving it any hypotheses whatsoever. And I was just kind of curious, what would it find? What would be the conclusions? It starts by saying, hey, there's a couple of columns, and there might be a couple of insights. And if I had to guess, it's basing all of this on the names of the columns. We've got steps, BMI, and gender, and it's probably not looking at the values just yet. It is just looking at those column names and coming up with all sorts of interesting hypotheses to check on its own. Right off the bat, that's not necessarily a bad start. Let's scroll down a little bit. It then starts asking me if I would be interested in visualizations and statistical summaries to highlight these trends. After which I replied by saying yes. And that's when it started to do a whole lot of plotting. This is the first plot. It is a distribution of steps, and you can see that there is indeed a distribution of sorts, a bunch more in the middle than on the sides, but not quite a normal distribution. This is the second chart, and again, feels like a distribution of sorts. A lot of people with somewhat high BMI, you could say. But here's the thing that made me kind of giggle. Eventually, it makes this chart, the steps versus body mass index chart. And I could complain a little bit about the choice of the color. The male and female crosses, they are red and orange, so it's kind of hard to distinguish between the two. But the main thing, if you're a human, right, you would look at this and you would kind of go, good grief, there's a gorilla in my dataset. What's up with this? After that, it goes further down and it starts making these comparisons by gender. So it does the steps per gender. And you can also see that there's a difference in body mass index. They largely overlap, it seems. And then it follows up with some summary statistics as well. After which, it gives me some very important key takeaways. There's stuff about the distribution of steps, and all sorts of things are being listed here. The stuff that's being listed isn't necessarily wrong, but it completely misses the gorilla in the dataset. It then ends by asking me if I'm interested in statistical tests, maybe some correlation analysis or t-tests, to confirm the trends that it has found. And I say yes, and it actually will go ahead and do all the statistical tests, and it will tell me about statistical significance and all that good stuff. So at this point in the conversation, I figured I should mention the gorilla. After all, we are getting a very statistically significant p-value, so this might be a good time to steer the conversation. And then something funny happened. So I asked, did you not notice the gorilla in the steps versus BMI chart? And the response was, haha, I see what you're getting at! Exclamation point. You're referring to the concept of inattentional blindness, where people miss something obvious because they're so focused on a specific task. In this case, I was analyzing the overall trends and numbers in steps versus BMI scatter plot, and may have missed on unusual or standout patterns. And then it starts suggesting things that it might do, like looking for outliers, looking for a cluster in the chart, or maybe any unusual grouping that doesn't align with expected correlations. And then with that knowledge, it starts to do yet another analysis, and it yet again starts making the chart with the gorilla in it. And it also makes a heat map, but I think this is an interesting one. So what I think is happening here is that it really is doing a couple of things, quite well. You can expand and inspect the code, and it's saving you a bunch of time, but it's not necessarily equipped with any tools to visually interpret what it's looking at over here, and especially if there's something hidden, something of a pattern, I suppose, or something that might require very specific business knowledge. You can kind of imagine how it would totally skip on the information in a chart. I cannot really blame it for not doing this out of the blue, because it really requires a lot of context to get this one thing right. Even when you've got billions of parameters flowing tensors in order to produce an analysis for you, coming to the right conclusion requires you to understand what is in the data, and that understanding doesn't come for free. It really tends to require some human attention now and again. There's a difference between data and information is what I'm trying to say here, and this gorilla in the data phenomenon is quite literal in this example, but most of the time when you're doing data analysis, it's typically a lot about, oh, am I sure that I understand the data? Am I sure I'm not missing out on a pattern? Is there maybe not something hidden that's so subtle, but actually tends to be very important for the use case that I've got? Now, one thing I do want to point out that I was somewhat impressed by, when I prompted it about this gorilla, quote unquote, which the quotes appear in the text, it did actually start to observe that there were maybe some very high step counts, as well as some very low BMIs, and that might be a gorilla in the dataset, quote unquote, which is legit, right? That's a fair observation. But the actual gorilla got skipped, of course. To give a little bit of extra credit that I do think is due, one thing I did like at the end over here is it did give me these possible explanations for some of the things that it saw. So there was this concern about a lot of steps, not a lot of steps, very high BMI, very low BMI. And it tends to maybe suggest that there could be a athletic subgroup in the data. It might also be a data entry error. There might also be some special conditions, right? These are not necessarily bad thoughts, but they're not the gorilla I was interested in. Next up, what would happen if I do give it hypotheses? Well, it did something interesting here too. So it's pretty much the same question, by the way. So I'm just asking, what is the main story in this data set? And as part of your analysis, I want you to check the following hypotheses. And these were the ones that I was able to grab from the internet. I believe these were the questions that were also in the paper. But then it starts off as it did before. It starts thinking about what hypothesis results could be, but then it also starts to make some charts. So it did the hypotheses checks quite literally as I asked. And then it also comes to some conclusions with some findings, like men take more steps than women, and apparently that's statistically significant. But then it starts making some visualizations of this as well. So first it starts doing the steps versus BMI for women, then it starts doing it for men as well, and then you see this distribution chart as well over here, but I didn't even bother asking it about the gorilla in the dataset. Also here, it's very safe to assume that it did not have the know-how to interpret a chart, and I will argue being able to interpret a chart is pretty important when you're doing analysis, for the simple reason that there might be a frigging gorilla in your dataset. Now, to conclude this video, I just want to really stand still and make this one observation. I can definitely imagine that for a lot of people out there, especially if you're not too well versed with Python and if you don't know all the libraries from the top of your head, that a data analyst feature like this is actually pretty darn useful. However, if you just blindly jump in and assume that it does everything for you, then you are at risk of using a data analyst to do analysis quote-unquote at scale while missing out on the gorilla in your dataset. And I think it will be good if maybe we take a step back and talk about this just a little bit more. A lot of the content that I see on YouTube on AI tools, they tend to be quite on the optimistic side of the spectrum, and if I'm being honest, quite clickbaity too. So what I figured might be good, if only as a counterbalance, is if I explore some of these failure scenarios a bit. AI tools, in the end, I do think are here to stay, and we're also at the point where I would actively recommend people not to ignore them. However, that doesn't mean that you can blindly trust these tools or that they're well suited to automate everything. Again, there might be a gorilla in your dataset. I think it's a really nice metaphor. So what I will do is I will just make a little playlist with examples just like this one. I'll probably explore a bunch of tools while I'm at it, but I am very keen to just start archiving a couple of these phenomenon in the hope that they might be good anecdotes for you to ground yourself and to also make you better at using these AI tools. The goal here isn't to become a skeptic, the goal here is to become just a little bit more knowledgeable, because if you want to be great at using some tools, it also helps to understand where their limits are. And I think that's going to be super interesting to explore. So if that sounds like fun, hit subscribe.